What is race? I've asked this question of a number of people, including self-professed racists, and no one's been able to give me an answer. In the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it says you're not supposed to discriminate based on national, ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability, or race. And when I first read this back in school when I was studying law, I questioned, what is race? What is race if it's not ethnicity or color or nationality? And I concluded that it doesn't really mean anything. And so I wanted to make a video about how I reached that conclusion and a bunch of the contradictions that I've noticed in racial classification. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't differences between people, what we usually call race. And I'm a materialist and I'm pro-science, and I acknowledge that genetics produces different traits that people inherit from one generation to the next, but I can't seem to nail down what this idea of race is. And I'm certainly not suggesting everyone's the same, but I think if you question racial classification and the way we split people up, it really doesn't make any sense. So let's look at some of the contradictions and inconsistencies, and then I also like to just touch on sort of people who rely on these notions of races, and also people who say they explicitly fight racism, because I've noticed that these people tend to use these contradictions for their arguments, both for and against. Now, the first thing is the difference between race and nationality, because I've noticed that a lot of times when people are talking about what a person's race is, they'll say, that person's Japanese, that person's Korean, that person's Filipino or Taiwanese, and obviously those are nationalities. Those are referring to a person's place of origin. And we already know that, to be Japanese in terms of nationality is different from to be Japanese racially, and that applies to all of these races, because clearly, someone can be born in, Canada or the U.S. and still be identified as racially, Korean. So when we talk about someone being, Taiwanese, are we talking about a nationality or a race? And at what point does this difference actually begin? Because if Japan were to split up into two countries, wouldn't both the Southern Japanese and the Northern Japanese, or whatever it was, wouldn't they be the same race? So at what point does a population become distinct enough to be its own race? If you look at the American system or the American way of thought, it tends to be that black is thought of as a race, but it wasn't too long ago that we called black people in America African American. And actually, we use the same thing in Canada. We call them African American, and a lot of people who now identify as black specifically point out that they're not African American. They don't have any connection to Africa, and they don't feel that they're African. So it's more accurate to call them black. But then we get into this other contradiction about color, because if you're calling someone black, you're really describing a swath of people that can come from a whole bunch of different places all around the globe. A person whose parents may have been Jamaican or, Caribbean is black, and so is someone whose parents came from East Africa, and so are, someone's parents who came from the other side of the African continent, or, any other place where you have people with especially dark skin. They're considered black. But now, not only are you looking at a whole bunch of different countries, but a whole bunch of different ethnicities, and the only marker that seems to unite them all is their skin color, And it seems to be part of American Canadian culture that we have white people, black people, what we call Asian people, and then brown people. And with so few categories, you have all kinds of people mixed into these colors. And again, if we go back to the Charter of Rights, color is a different category from race. So if there's not a contradiction here, it's at least very confusing. And racial classification doesn't really seem to make sense even at that level. So you might say, well, there are demographic advantages to having these races laid out, because then you can see, how many Asian people do we have participating in X program or living in Y place. But how much does that actually tell you if what you're really measuring is just the color of people? Now below I've linked to an article that you can check out. You can even open it up and follow along. I'd like to read one of the paragraphs I felt was interesting. Quote, "And finally, new races are not discovered and slotted into existing classification system. They are created by carving up the classification system in a different way. Consider, for instance, the racial categories used in the U.S. Census. In 1977, the U.S. government established 4 racial categories for its census: American Indian, or Alaskan Native, Asian or Pacific Islander, Black, and White. 20 years later, the categories were revised by the addition of a 5th race, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, created by splitting the Asian or Pacific Island category into 2. This was not because a new race had been discovered, but because social changes required new forms of identity." So that's basically what I was talking about before. We know that genetic traits exist and there are differences between these groups, but not many can be said to be exclusive to any one group. So the classification kind of breaks down. There's also the issue of people who either don't belong in one category or another, or belong in multiple categories. Now, it came up recently in the news that there was a dating site established for white people in particular, whites who wanted to meet whites. I can't remember what it was called, but people rightfully pointed out that this sort of thing has existed for a long time for other races and, particular religions. If you were a Jewish person, you could find another Jewish person to date on any number of different sites specifically for that. And it brought up the question of, well, what if you were half black and half white? Would you be welcome in one or the other, or both? And at what point do you qualify? These sorts of contradictions are probably the most common that I find, is that if you're a mixed race person, are you a third race, or how does that work? And what if all 4 of your grandparents are all completely different looking people? Then the whole system of classification breaks down, and it again becomes just a subjective title that you apply to yourself and that others apply to you. Now, one thing I always hear when I bring up this idea that, for instance, there isn't a black person, there's black in terms of color, but as a race it doesn't make sense, is this this idea of vulnerability to certain diseases. So it's said, for instance, that black people are at a higher risk for sickle cell anemia. But that doesn't really work either, because if we were to use that high risk as a way to classify black people, then it poses a challenge. How much of an above average risk does someone have to have in order to classify as black? And if they do, then does it not matter what their color is? If I'm at a high risk for anemia and I appear to be white, am I then black? Or is it a combination of having a dark enough skin color and having this risk for anemia? And we also know that this so-called black disease is created through malaria. It's as a result of ancestors being exposed to malaria. But we also know that in South Africa, they don't have this trait because malaria isn't a problem in that area. And we also know that there are non-black people living in South Africa and have been for now a few generations. And I don't think anyone would identify them as black. So again, this doesn't really make sense. I know from my personal experiences, I knew a girl once who was from Trinidad, and she was, in terms of all of her traits, very Caucasian. I never examined her skull or anything, but because they say that different races have different skull shapes, but she seemed to be very typical of a white girl. But when she spoke, she had a very thick Trinidadian accent, and she identified as Trinidadian, right? And she would always have to point out, well, there are lots of white people in Trinidad. So if you were to use Trinidad, if you were to say people from there are one race, you would find that there was quite a number of different people who you were lumping into that group. Now, I wanted to touch on some of these people who really identify with their races, even though, again, I'm not sure what exactly it is they're identifying with. Now, the first people who I've spoken to recently online, and I've sort of been, looking through the websites and stuff, are white supremacists and white nationalists. One thing I noticed is that there are memes like this idea of white genocide, which doesn't really make sense in the context of what they're talking about, because they're talking about racial purity, about people intermarrying, interbreeding with people who they call white, and thereby decreasing the number of so-called pure white people. Now, aside from the obvious that you go back far enough and you have someone non-white in your genetics, genocide doesn't mean that. I mean, genocide means that an ethnic group is being killed off. Like the genocide in Rwanda was a genocide. It involved a civil war, and one ethnic group was being pitted against the other. I don't think anyone's coming to kill the white people in North America. But there is this tendency, it seems, for these people to really look at the world through this racial lens. And again, by racial in this context, I mean really just color. And it's the same thing with black nationalists that I've noticed mostly in the U.S., where they talk about everything in terms of, white people and black people. There are white banks and black banks, and white churches and black churches. And sure, we know what they're referring to, but it seems like there's this impossibility to look at the world through any other lens. And so they can't see past that. They can't see mechanisms or politics or other things going on that have nothing to do with the races, and it seems to really blind them, to color their vision, no pun intended. And so that brings me to the people who fight racism, because I've also noticed in the social justice crowd there'll be this tendency to classify people as oppressors and the oppressed. And it's the same thing, it's the same principle with things like affirmative action, where you're taking a group and putting it ahead of the other in the intent to bring them up to the other group's level. But of course, the obvious contradiction there is that if you put someone ahead of the line, you're moving other people back, and so it's just racism. And again, it's racism without really even understanding what race is, because it seems from the contradictions we've already gone over that race doesn't make sense. So I guess what I'd really like to end with is a question to you. If you can identify for me what race is as separate from nationality or ethnic origin or place of birth, then I'd really like to understand, because I've spoken to self-professed racists and nobody can explain to me what race means. It seems like it's really just this objective thing, and the classification works subjectively. We split up people depending on the social context at the time. If you'd like to learn more, I'm also going to leave the link to the Wikipedia article on racial classification in the description box. And if you can tell me what it is beyond just folk taxonomy, then go ahead, because as far as I can tell right now, it seems to just be a concept that changes from person to person. It seems completely arbitrary and subjective. But tell me if you figured it out, and I'll see you guys next time.